Catholic school nun band Bruce's music, what she discovered, that 20 years later changed everything. In 1975, Sister Margaret Catherine stood at the front of St. Mary's Catholic High School in Red Bank, New Jersey, holding a cassette tape like it was evidence in a murder trial. "Born to Run" was written across the label in a 17-year-old's messy handwriting. What she said next would divide a community, destroy a family, and launch a crusade that would haunt her for 2 decades. But what Sister Margaret discovered 20 years later about Bruce Springsteen's music didn't just change her mind. It changed her soul. If these incredible stories about redemption and second chances move you, subscribe. This journey gets unbelievable. October 15th, 1975. St. Mary's Catholic High School, Red Bank, New Jersey. Sister Margaret Catherine had been teaching religion and moral education for 18 years. At 45, she was known throughout Monmouth County's Catholic community as a fierce defender of traditional values. A woman who believed that rock and roll music was a gateway to moral corruption. That morning, she'd walked into her third period religion class to find something that made her blood run cold. Tommy Castellano, 17 years old, Italian Catholic honor student, was quietly listening to music through headphones connected to a small cassette player. His eyes were closed, his lips moving slightly, completely transported by whatever he was hearing. "Mr. Castellano," Sister Margaret said sharply, "remove those headphones immediately." Tommy's eyes snapped open, his face flushing red. He'd been caught completely off guard, lost in Bruce Springsteen's lyrics about breaking free from small-town limitations. "What exactly are you listening to during our lesson about Christian moral behavior?" Sister Margaret demanded, her voice carrying across the silent classroom. Tommy handed over the cassette player with shaking hands. Sister Margaret looked at the tape label, and her face went pale with fury. "Born to Run" on a Bruce Springsteen. What happened next would be talked about in Red Bank for years. Sister Margaret held up the cassette tape for the entire class to see. "This," she announced, "is exactly what I've been warning you about. This so-called music is poison. It celebrates rebellion against authority, against family, against everything we hold sacred as Catholics." Tommy tried to defend his hero. "Sister, if you actually listen to the lyrics, Bruce sings about working-class people, about struggles that... I don't need to listen to garbage to know it's garbage." Sister Margaret's voice was ice-cold. "Mr. Castellano, you will choose, right now, in front of this entire class, on your faith or this sinner's music." The classroom was dead silent. 28 students held their breath as Tommy Castellano faced the most important decision of his young life. "I choose Bruce," Tommy said quietly. "His music means something to me. It gives me hope." Sister Margaret's face turned white with rage. "Then you choose to reject everything this school stands for. Get out of my classroom. You're suspended." But Sister Margaret wasn't finished. As Tommy packed his books, she made an announcement that would change everything. Effective immediately, Bruce Springsteen's music is banned from this school. Any student caught with his recordings will face suspension. We will not allow the devil's music to corrupt young Catholic minds. What started as a classroom discipline issue became a community-wide crusade. Within a week, Sister Margaret had organized what she called the Music Morality Campaign. She contacted local radio stations, pressuring them to stop playing Springsteen's music. She wrote letters to venue owners, asking them to cancel his concerts. The campaign gained momentum when local newspapers picked up the story. Catholic school declares war on rock star, read one headline. But the real tragedy was what happened to Tommy Castellano. When Tommy arrived home that day, suspended and humiliated, his deeply Catholic parents sided with Sister Margaret. "You've brought shame on our family," his father said. "You've chosen that rock and roll trash over your faith." The family was torn apart. Tommy's parents threatened to disown him if he didn't publicly apologize and renounce Springsteen's music. Tommy refused. At 17, he moved out, finishing high school while working nights at a diner. But something extraordinary happened during those difficult months. Living in Asbury Park, Tommy discovered that Bruce's music wasn't about rebellion. It was about dignity, about finding meaning in struggle, about caring for people who felt forgotten. Tommy started volunteering at local shelters. He began working with struggling veterans. He realized that Bruce's songs had taught him something Sister Margaret's rigid rules never could, that serving others was the highest form of faith. Meanwhile, Miss Sister Margaret's crusade continued for years. When Bruce released Darkness on the Edge of Town, even some conservative Catholics began noticing his lyrics dealt with redemption and moral struggle. But Sister Margaret doubled down on her position. 20 years passed. By 1995, Sister Margaret Catherine was 65 and assigned to St. Vincent's Hospice in Asbury Park. It was supposed to be peaceful work, quiet reflection, a spiritual guidance for people in their final hours. But something at the hospice disturbed Sister Margaret deeply. The patients kept requesting Bruce Springsteen's music. Elderly patients who should have found comfort in traditional hymns were asking to hear Thunder Road and the River. The hospice music therapist gently challenged her. "Sister, I've never seen music bring peace to dying people the way Bruce Springsteen's songs do. There's something deeply spiritual about them." "Nonsense," Sister Margaret replied. "Spiritual music is hymns and sacred songs, not rock and roll." But then Sister Margaret witnessed something that shook her to her core. A dying man named Frank Rizzo, 73 years old, a lifelong Catholic who hadn't missed Sunday Mass in 50 years, was in his final hours. His family had gathered around his bed, and Frank was struggling, frightened, unable to find peace. Sarah, the music therapist, asked the family if there was any music that brought Frank comfort. His daughter spoke up. "Dad always loved Thunder Road. He said it reminded him of when he first met our mother." Sister Margaret started to object, but Sarah was already cueing up the song as Bruce Springsteen's gentle piano and harmonica filled the room. Something miraculous happened. Frank Rizzo's breathing became calm. His face relaxed. He smiled for the first time in days. And as Bruce sang about rolling down the window and letting the wind blow through your hair, about redemption and second chances, Frank Rizzo died peacefully, surrounded by love. Sister Margaret stood in the corner of that room, tears streaming down her face, watching a sacred moment that had been facilitated by music she'd spent 20 years condemning. That night, Sister Margaret Catherine did something she'd never done before. She went to the hospice music library and checked out every Bruce Springsteen album they had. She took them back to her small apartment in the convent. She put on headphones, said a prayer asking for wisdom, and pressed play on Nebraska. What she heard changed everything she thought she knew about Bruce Springsteen. These weren't songs about rebellion. They were songs about redemption. They weren't about rejecting faith. They were about finding God in broken places. Also, they weren't about running away from responsibility. They were about carrying the weight of caring for others. The ghost of Tom Joad brought her to tears. Here was a rock star singing about serving the poorest and most forgotten members of society, singing about the same people Jesus had called Christians to serve. Atlantic City made her think about families struggling to survive economic hardship. The river told the story of young people whose dreams were crushed by circumstances beyond their control. And Nebraska was a meditation on evil, redemption, and the mystery of human nature that was as profound as anything she'd encountered in theology school. Sister Margaret spent the entire night listening to Bruce Springsteen's music. By dawn, she was sobbing, not just because she'd been wrong, but because she realized how much damage her wrongness had caused. The next day, Sister Margaret began making phone calls. She tracked down Tommy Castellano, the student she'd suspended 20 years earlier. Tommy was now 37 years old, a successful social worker specializing in helping homeless veterans. He ran a non-profit organization that provided housing and counseling services. But when Sister Margaret called him, Tommy was shocked to hear her voice. "Tommy," she said, her voice shaking, "I need to ask your forgiveness." Tommy listened as Sister Margaret told him about her experience at the hospice, about finally listening to Bruce's music, about realizing that everything she'd fought against was actually everything she'd spent her life trying to teach. Bruce Springsteen was teaching the same lessons I was trying to teach, she admitted. Compassion for the poor, dignity for working people, the importance of family and community, and hope in the face of struggle. I was so concerned about the messenger that I never listened to the message. Tommy was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something that broke Sister Margaret's heart and began her healing at the same time. "Sister," he said gently, "Bruce's music saved my life. When my family rejected me because I wouldn't renounce his songs, those songs kept me believing that I mattered, that my struggles had meaning. They led me to a life of service. They taught me that taking care of people who are forgotten is the most important work you can do." Sister Margaret Catherine spent the next 3 years of her life making amends. She wrote letters to every student she disciplined for listening to rock music. She contacted the radio stations she'd pressured, asking them to forgive her campaign. She visited the families that had been divided by her moral crusade. Most importantly, she started a new program at the hospice called Music as Ministry. The program recognized that spiritual comfort could come from many sources, not just traditional religious music. Sister Margaret trained other chaplains and volunteers to listen carefully to what dying patients really needed, not what religious authorities thought they should need. The program became a model for hospices across the country. Tommy Castellano became the director of the Music as Ministry program after Sister Margaret retired. The student she'd once suspended became her closest collaborator in creating a more compassionate approach to end-of-life care. In 1998, Sister Margaret Catherine wrote a letter to Bruce Springsteen. She never sent it, but it was found among her papers after her death in 2003. "Dear Mr. Springsteen, I spent 20 years fighting against your music because I was afraid it would lead young people away from God. What I discovered is that your songs were leading them toward God all along. I now believe that artists like you are doing some of the most important spiritual work in our society. You're comforting the afflicted, which is exactly what Jesus did." Bruce Springsteen never received that letter, but he did quietly support the hospice's work through anonymous donations for years. When asked about it later, he said simply, "Sister Margaret and I were probably trying to accomplish the same thing. We just took different roads to get there. Today, Tommy Castellano continues to run programs that help veterans and homeless individuals find hope through music and community service. He keeps a photo on his desk from Sister Margaret's memorial service, where he delivered the eulogy. In that eulogy, he said something that captured the heart of her transformation. Sister Margaret taught me that the most important spiritual lesson isn't about being right. It's about being willing to be wrong, and then having the courage to change. She spent 20 years fighting against music that she thought was leading people away from God. But when she finally listened with her heart instead of her fear, she discovered that music was leading people home all along. The story of Sister Margaret Catherine and Tommy Castellano reminds us that redemption is always possible, that the things we fight against might be the very things God is using to accomplish His work. Sometimes the most sacred music doesn't come from a church organ. Sometimes it comes from a guitar singing about working people's struggles and hopes. And sometimes the most powerful sermons aren't preached from pulpits. They're sung from stages, teaching us that everyone deserves dignity and redemption. Sometimes being wrong is the first step toward being truly right. And sometimes God's voice can be heard anywhere, by anyone willing to truly listen. Even if it takes 20 years to hear it.